Welcome to the Public Engagement with Science 2020 Conference, Defining and Measuring Success. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Heather Douglas, and I am in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. I hope you have had a chance to talk to the poster presenters earlier today, but now, today, we have a panel focused on stakeholder engagement, a particular form of public engagement. Stakeholders are people who represent existing interests in a resource that needs complex scientific and public management. As noted in our blog, we do not consider sovereign entities such as indigenous peoples, self-governance, or nation states to be stakeholders. We will discuss those kinds of engagement of those entities tomorrow in the cross-border panel. Stakeholders are not general members of the public, nor are they necessarily from one community. The challenge with stakeholders is often to recruit the proper set of stakeholder representatives from the start and to keep them working effectively together, despite the divergent interests they represent. So for today's webinar, we will have this format. Each panelist will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. Panelists will then have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the issues raised in their talks amongst themselves. And I'm sure they'll have a lot to talk about. We will then open the floor to Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions, to comment on questions, and to upvote questions for the panelists. Please follow the community standards for the event found on our website and also emailed to you in your Eventbrite confirmation. On Twitter, please use hashtag Pews2020. Ellie will also be tweeting about the event there. Recordings of talks will be posted on the YouTube channel, Pews 2020, after the event, link to which can be found also from the main website. For any technical issues that we can help you with, which is not a lot of things, but we can help you with some things, please email pews2020.tech@gmail.com. And be sure to join us immediately after the event for an open reception on Spatial Chat. You received the link for that as well. But we have first our panel. We have an excellent group of people to discuss these issues today. There's first Shannon Dosemagen, who is a Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow working on the Open Environmental Data Project. She was a co-founder of Public Lab and an executive director from 2010 to 2020. She has been chair of both the US EPA National Advisory Council on Environmental Policy and Technology and the Citizen Science Association. Then we have Eric Kennedy, who is an assistant professor of disaster and emergency management at York University in Toronto, Canada. His research focuses on expertise, institutions, and knowledge production within the context of emergency management, particularly in wildfire management. I have no doubt that his life is super busy right now. So he is co-editor of the Citizen Science volume in the Rightful Place of Science series. Jen Schneider is professor of public policy in the School of Public Service at Boise State University. She frequently works as a public engagement specialist for teams of scientists, engineers, and other experts. Recently, she has been working with local and regional governments on growth management strategies. And finally, we have Laura Van Riper, who has been a social scientist and conflict resolution specialist with the National Riparian Service Team in the Bureau of Land Management since 2003. She also works extensively with the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management's Collaborative Action and Dispute Resolution Program. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the Department of Interior Superior Service Award in 2016. You can read more about each of our panelists, including statements about how they think about success in their work, on our website. But now, let's get this panel started with Shannon. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Give me 1 minute. Things set up. Okay, can we see that? All right. Are we able to see my screen okay? Yes, okay. All right, so thanks so much for having me. This is an interesting panel for me to sit on. I think I would self-categorize myself a bit more as a practitioner kind of on the doing and making and figuring things out so that stakeholders can have better relations and kind of working situations, I guess. But I just wanted to kind of take you a bit on a journey of how my work has evolved over the last, I would say, decade or so. And I was the executive director of an organization called Public Lab, which is a nonprofit, but also supports a very vast open source community that works globally around the world using open technology to support communities in addressing environmental challenges, such as flying kites and balloons to address the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010. When we started seeing the massive amounts of open technology come into the space and lots of different scientists and people who were interested in the potential of open hardware and open technologies in other formats, start to kind of really bloom in 2015, I began working with another group kind of as a side project to create what's called the Gathering for Open Science Hardware as a space for people, scientists and technologists and policymakers and many different projects across all of the varieties of science that are using open hardware to accomplish their goals. But there's a lot of issues that in kind of both spaces I started to notice that we needed to overcome, and thus I'm at this moment trying to tackle some of those as a fellow with the Shuttleworth Foundation, working on the Open Environmental Data Project, which aims to address some of the gaps in how community level scientific data can be impactful for decision making and policy agendas in support of local priorities. So I'm going to sort of take you on a journey of the broad stakeholder landscapes that I have been a part of in my work and try to kind of point at some of the places where I think there's opportunities and also challenges that lie ahead. So Public Lab, as I mentioned, was and is very focused on designing and using environmental mapping and monitoring tools to document things such as rapid and slow change events with the people who are affected by these events. So for instance, this is one of the maps that came from flying a balloon in the Gulf of Mexico during the oil spill. Even at this time though, so 10 years ago, it was evident that without a clear line of input and feedback loop that is designed to move data from the community to decision makers or people who can make action happen during an event like this, and then back to the community as actions, unless the goal is ultimately to do things like gain media attention. It was really hard to create useful community-driven data narratives and kind of flows of how that information would move. And this was the engagement model that we were using. Our objective, and it still is, was to pair scientific and technical expertise with expertise in organizing and education and the local and lived experiences of communities to create action all down this pipeline, from working with people on asking questions, identifying issues, looking at what data was available, and if there wasn't data available, going out and collecting that data, interpreting it, and then using it towards actionable purposes. And I have to say on this slide, it was funny, I was starting to think deeper and deeper about the concept of science and stakeholder engagement, and realizing that in my own work and then kind of the way that I approach this whole genre is that we never use those concepts. We never talk about science engagement or stakeholder engagement, but we talk about how science could be better utilized by people in asking and answering questions about their communities and in supporting their already happening organizing activities. So this really was kind of the centrifuge of our approach. These are a couple of slides from the Gathering for Open Science Hardware and more from the open science hardware world. And to note, this was a very kind of different group of stakeholders that were coming into the space in support of community monitoring and a number of other scientific practices. So a central component to make community monitoring possible in the model in which Public Lab was working was the ability for people who were affected by environmental pollution to be able to do their own monitoring, but tools were typically created without accessibility in mind. So the incorporation of this group from GOSH and others, stakeholders from a different community segment, were really essential as we thought about our own work in community monitoring. And just if people are not familiar with open hardware, in short, open hardware argues that plans, protocols, and material lists for scientific instruments should be shared, accessible, and able to be replicated. So the importance of open hardware is that a lot of modern scientific equipment is a consumer product that's patented. It's not supplied with full design information, which makes it really difficult to repair and thus also blocks creativity and the ability for customization of scientific equipment. And despite big advances in technology, many scientific endeavors are still being held back by the lack of access to hardware for even routine experimental techniques, such as in the landscape of community monitoring. And this limits the ability of groups to engage in the scientific process, especially groups outside of well-funded research institutions. So we wanted to fix this by bringing this group under the banner of GOSH Together. And that meant working with stakeholders from about 40 countries or so who would come to the GOSH gatherings around a set of values and principles that started to really get at the core of our activities. And these were things such as prioritizing local knowledge and expertise and cognitive justice, having equity embedded in the design of our open hardware tools, creating tools that are locally accessible and customizable based on needs, having larger communities developed around the support of technology, making sure that tools are accessible and low cost if possible, and then recognizing that the power of open hardware can also improve knowledge transfer, international collaboration, and accelerated innovation. So the combination of community monitoring and this emerging world of open hardware pointed to some major opportunities, but also issues that really made me want to focus on how we are moving different forms of data that's being collected to align with actions. And this is kind of where I ended up landing with my current project. So as part of the EPA's National Advisory Council on Environmental Policy and Technology, which is now defunct, we drafted this spectrum of actions back in 2016 from the type of engaged practices we're working with, and found that while many could successfully impact the zones of engagement, education, management, research, far fewer were seeing success in being part of calls for government accountability or providing the check and balance that community data can in the spectrum of policy and agenda setting, regulation, and enforcement. So again, our goal really became how can data and how can community voice and input be utilized towards action in these kinds of decision-making scenarios. So there's a number of challenges that we face in stakeholder engagement, and specifically in the realm of how data can move into action in a meaningful way. And just to touch on a couple of them, again, being able to move data to be supportive and interface in the policy standard setting, regulation scenarios that can be beneficial for communities. Creating a policy culture that matches the drive that we currently have as a society for technology innovation, which requires numerous stakeholder groups to see that through to fruition. And then developing interoperation of systems for both data and hardware in the scientific space, as well as conceptualizing a governance model that is conducive to multiple projects, data streams, and places of input. To accomplish this, it takes a lot of actors who are willing to think, work, and try out new ideas in tandem. But if we can start to tackle these challenges, we're not only going to shift from an environmental data maze where things are kind of chaotic and based on one scenario or another, to an environmental data pipeline, but also see clearer ways for people to actively think about the ability for a multidisciplinary set of stakeholders to each play roles in the check and balance of environmental management and protection. This kind of engagement and willingness to work together and with other stakeholders can also demonstrate reflectiveness by government agents towards the core mandate of agencies, environmental and human health protection, rather than being a gatekeeper of this responsibility. This instead means acting as a conduit in partnership with the public towards enforcement, regulation, and ultimately protection. So this type of multi-stakeholder approach can help to potentially rebuild trust in our federal agencies and their actions, especially at a time as critical as this and in this political moment. So maybe this all sounds interesting, good, but what does this look like in practice? So I want to leave you with a couple of examples of the work that we're doing or starting in on in the project that I'm currently working on. So the first is addressing issues in the open scientific hardware world so that tools are more usable in decision-making and as a conduit between stakeholders. There's forms of data that have a clear pathway to use by agencies, geospatial, photographic, public commentary, for instance. However, data quality, especially from the emerging landscape of sensor projects, is really a new frontier for agencies. Considering the urgency of our current environmental situation, employing and engaging the new generation of DIY sensors can allow agencies to rethink how they engage with the public, who shares the same goal of a healthy environment. So similar to how agencies engage with people in collecting and interpreting data as citizen or community scientists, which they're relatively friendly to, there are lots of people who are ready to partner with agencies on making sure that technology being created is useful. So in recognition of the potential of coarse or trend environmental data as a powerful tool yet to be recognized, one concrete approach we're working on is with a network to create a value-centered methodology for distributed manufacturing around the microscope that's in this picture, this slide, Open Flexure. And it is being done in conjunction with developers, engineers, social scientists, biochemists, lawyers, and others. So why this approach? Because it will help us to micro in on some of the ecosystem-wide challenges that are preventing the adoption of low-cost and open hardware tools, such as documentation, QA, QC, et cetera. Things that we all have a stake in seeing usable technology come into fruition in the future. On a very different note, one of the other projects that we are working on is called the Side Environmental Event. So in May 2020, the House of Representatives passed HR 965, which is an emergency measure in response to COVID-19, allowing for congressional deliberations to occur at a distance with remote committee procedures and proxy voting. So this has given us the opportunity to work with a cross-section of stakeholders to build out the SIDE, which stands for Stakeholders, Individuals, Data, Evidence, Environmental Hearing Model, focusing on input of public commentary on an environmental pollution and or the climate crisis related issue in different congressional districts, and at the same time, building out feedback loops through a system for storing public commentary that belongs to the public and can then provide a model for federal repositories so that this data and information will become part of the congressional record, with the hope that when congressional committees are making decisions, they will have readily available community level information in conjunction with those decisions. Why we're doing this? There are multiple truths. Scientific data can provide factual information, but the contextual information around that data can show how people are experiencing an event differently. So for instance, how they are being affected through what they see, smell, hear, feel at different times of day. We can most clearly see overall impacts in the environment and our communities by considering these different contextual sets of information and using a broad diversity of approaches, methods, and reasonings from different people. Very finally, I'm just going to leave you with, we're kind of at a what if moment in this project. So just getting started on it. And with different stakeholders, we are starting to think through a system for how we can create stronger checks and balances between invested communities and government by conceptualizing methods for self-defined groups to have more agency in how environmental management and protection is being done in practice. So we'd like to re-envision ways in which there is a true check and balance system between self-defined groups and the administrative law system that currently operates, potentially through models of emulating parts of data trusts or collectives that center on clear priority and value-driven governance frameworks to information ownership, management, and use. And then things such as a metric system for government rules and operation, which can be used between self-defined groups and government, and that can give a level of authority and rule implementation to local groups. So again, we're at the very early stages of this. My final slide has a couple of links, and if you're interested, please feel free to follow along. So thank you very much, and I am going to try to stop sharing and pass it on to the next person.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Eric, take it away.
Thanks so much, and thanks for a great panel here. Already there are themes connecting us. So in Shannon's conversation, I mean, I'm also coming from a field here where we do a ton of public engagement and don't call it that. And so this is a great and interesting topic. And then from Heather's initial remarks, this idea of the conflicting views and ideologies between stakeholders is so critical because as I listened last week, I just kept hearing publics being used as a singular term and thinking about the controversy and contestation that happens here. And so I'm excited to unpack that a little bit through lenses like emergencies of wildfire and COVID as pictured here. So emergency management is a really interesting place in which to examine success in stakeholder engagement, both because we do a lot of it and don't call it that, but also because we have a historical tendency to be a field that strongly emphasizes regimes of command and control. Early emergency management, in the sense of fires and floods and pandemics and the like, traces its origin story to wartime civil defense. And so this attitude has carried forward into a really centralized, hierarchical, command and control centric approach to governing emergencies, particularly in the American context, wherein emergency management has a lot of connection to militarization, policing, and integration controversially into the Department of Homeland Security. And likewise, even the question of whether policing should or should not be counted as emergency management is a norm that's being called into question now, because of increasing realizations about the nature and purpose and tactics of the sector. And that dramatically alters the analysis here. But regardless of which angle you take on emergency management, or even which country you're in, it's a discipline that's obsessed, to put it mildly, with achieving effective communication through preset hierarchies, such as the incident command system that's pictured here. Indeed, when past disasters have gone wrong, it's often attributed by emergency managers to a lack of centralization rather than, say, a lack of public engagement. So after Fort McMurray and the wildfire in 2016 in Alberta, for instance, the post-incident reviews emphasized a lack of sufficient unified command as the substantive problem, rather than, say, a lack of public engagement. And where we have had efforts at public engagement, they've almost always been sort of deficit-oriented public education campaigns. This idea of control of information exchange has dominated the conversation. And it hasn't been until the past couple of decades that we've seen truly participatory turns emerging. I would argue that they take on two forms in public engagement, and I think that in understanding those two forms is really critical to understanding what they each say about working with stakeholders. So one form of public, the participatory turn, if we can call it that, has arisen through increases in the scope of emergency management. So for a long time, emergency management has been very focused on this bottom corner here of response, what we do during the crisis itself. And over the past decades, there's been this increasing realization that emergency management cannot be effective if it's constrained only to that corner of the quadrant. Rather, it has to look at mitigation, right? How do we reduce the hazards? How do we prepare for and build resilience? How do we build back better? And this shift away from an undue emphasis on response towards these other components has resulted in a massive increase in need for public engagement, because that's how we identify hazards, how we persuade people to relocate, how we design new communities. And so this first participatory turn in broadening the emergency management endeavor reveals that basically all forms of new EM are public engagement, and challenges it in that way. Now, there are, of course, still lots of limitations with this. Doesn't mean that there's been much exchange between science communication or public engagement and EM communities. And even those cases that do, in passing, use the same language, like this example here, are focusing very much on deficit-style projects, right? Cases where a national organization comes in to help communities prepare, and the engagement exercises are facilitated towards a very predetermined end. This idea of heavy deficit framings and instrumentalist approaches is something that we'll return to shortly. I should, though, mention the second participatory turn here, the other approach to justifying public engagement in EM, even though it's much more controversial. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina and Harvey and others, there's been a rightful acknowledgement of the ways that traditional emergency management has failed its constituents. And so a subset of researchers and even practitioners and community members have used this as an opportunity to point out that much of emergency response is organic and community-led. It's built within the grassroots community itself. And so things like the Cajun Navy that's pictured here, swooping in to respond where the state actors had failed, represents a fundamental reorganization of emergency management as a field. Whereas the first form of the participatory turn enshrines centralized control activities over a broader scope of practice, this strand is much more subversive. It seeks to subvert the norms of who's in charge, of who's responsible, of who ought to act. Now, I will say it's challenging to assess which one of these is the correct model, right? This debate is largely dogmatic. There's an excess of case studies and they're radically underdetermined, meaning that you can leverage whatever evidence you want in support of either side of this argument, depending on your pre-existing predilections. And so the truth likely lies somewhere in the middle of these, but you can see how they each have very different views of what the role of the stakeholder is and what constitutes success in emergency management. Now, Heather has challenged me to discuss specifically what success looks like with engaging stakeholders in emergency management. And I've mentioned that it's largely instrumentalist already. So for emergency managers, the idea of working with stakeholders is really reducible to the desire of improving public safety outcomes. There are a handful of exceptions, and they're important to this, right? So the engagement of Indigenous and other local communities to ensure that their perspectives are represented has a different kind of flair, but the vast majority of stakeholder interactions are centered on this instrumentalist notion of we'll get buy-in, we'll get compliance, we'll get local knowledge, and ergo, we will be able to manage public safety more effectively. It's interesting to note, though, that stakeholders have the same kind of instrumentalist view when it comes to public engagement too, though, right? For them, moments of public engagement represent opportunities to secure funding for local projects, to advance particular views of the futures that they want to see enacted, or even to extract information from emergency management as an enterprise. So to give some examples of this from wildfire management, which is where I tend to work most of the time, you can look at different stakeholder groups seeking to obtain funding and permissions for vegetation thinning, for logging, for prescribed burning, or trying to get injunctions and blocks against the other stakeholders trying to do that. You can look at the way that different stakeholder groups will at times advance diametrically opposed views of how an ecosystem should be cultivated. In Canada, you see this play out sometimes with debates between which kinds of animals you prefer. Are you a moose person or a caribou person? Some of them like early succession, frequently burned landscapes. Others like fire excluded, long preserved climax communities. And so depending on which animal you prefer from a hunting perspective or other perspective, that shapes what your view is about how fire ought to be managed. And indeed, sometimes this is about getting information about past fires from the government, a very instrumental mode to allow stakeholder groups to pick mushrooms. This is where they want to get into these ecosystems that have recently burned and want information that the emergency managers have to allow them to collect these mushrooms or hunt other animals. So this instrumentalist view has really convenient outcomes in some ways because measuring success is very easy, right? The groups have clear objectives, both on the manager and stakeholder side, and they can evaluate whether they met that. For the emergency managers, in a deficit instrumentalist kind of mode, it's very easy to assess whether you've succeeded, even if there are some tenuous theories of change, like the idea that increased engagement will automatically result in buy-in, which will automatically result in evacuation compliance. You at least have what you think is a very clear measure of success in, did our engagement with stakeholders increase the number of people who evacuated? Of course, the second participatory turn would take issue with all of this framing, but even the first one has some challenges to put forward here. So as the scope of emergency management expands to include mitigation, preparedness, and recovery, so too do the measures of success for stakeholder engagement become a lot more nebulous and complex, right? If we switch from a conversation about narrow notions of compliance with evacuation to a complex conversation about getting individuals to prepare their properties in a meaningful way and become fire resilient, these kinds of complicated interventions have less clear points of measurement. And so this means that themes like relationship and trust building become much more relevant, just like have shown up in other case studies. In other words, the more we broaden the definition of what counts as EM, the more we run into all the same kinds of challenges of amorphous and difficult success objectives that we've seen in other presentations in this conference. It also questions some of the norms that emergency managers have been quite happy to take for granted over the years, which is that the goals of emergency management are clear, broadly agreed upon, and socially acceptable. When you see emergency management through a narrow response-based lens, for instance, there's relatively low contestation about what are acceptable goals and what aren't. So for instance, you might have some peripheral conversations about liberty versus mandatory evacuation, but by and large, there's agreement that saving lives is a good thing. When you broaden emergency management out to building resilient communities, this opens up a lot more value-based terrain to debate what a resilient community ought to look like, therefore giving each of the stakeholder groups a lot more landscape in which to play in the debates. So reorienting the enterprise of emergency management from response to the other three phases inherently opens up more value-based conversations. And there become very explicit trade-offs between heterogeneous and fractured stakeholder communities that seek opposing fire policy based on whether their species of choice prefers frequently or infrequently burned landscapes. These conversations become highly politicized, highly values-based. And in some ways, public engagement can provide fodder for these, but can risk concealing lots of structural problems depending on how these efforts are politically constructed, how they're structurally built, who they privilege and who they disenfranchise. So you could imagine this being much like the arguments made by Sarowitz, Pilkey, and others about the dangers of appealing to science as an arbiter. Right? Appealing to public engagement as an arbiter, or stakeholder engagement as an arbiter here, doesn't actually do much more than push the problem one level deeper to asking these questions about, well, how are we actually going to resolve the value debates when we've heard about them? And so these questions that we've been able to avoid historically in emergency management, it ultimately now turns a practitioner community that had clear marching orders into one that faces a highly contestable political value-based set of questions about what visions of the good life ought to be protected. I want to end by adding one more provocation, which was based on a really great conversation I had with Dr. Branch earlier about their wonderful poster today. And so to think about a couple of themes that came up on that, I think much like we need to be cautious of viewing the public or stakeholders as an overly homogenous group, we also need to be wary of the massively fractured nature of the government itself. So emergency managers often find themselves in a difficult bind where, despite being now expected to do mitigation, preparedness, and recovery, they don't have the jurisdictional authority to do any of those things, right? They're often told to mitigate against hazards despite having no authority for zoning, building codes, social services, education, and the like. And likewise, characters like who you see here on the screen are ultimately the ones who make decisions about financial assistance, despite that going through intermediaries in emergency management. And so this expectation creep can make it challenging to foster trust or engage the public. It can also be particularly challenging when you have temporal constraints, particularly if you focus on the notion of needing to garner rationally grounded trust and attend to past errors with your stakeholders. So much of emergency management involves figuring out and making decisions about things that are fundamentally unknowable, like whether COVID has asymptomatic spread or where the wildfire will go. And so how you deal with these situations is really challenging when your real and perceived responsibilities outstrip your jurisdiction and when hindsight inevitably condemns a non-trivial fraction of your real-time decisions. And so with that, I want to be mindful of time here and pause, but I really look forward to the conversations and I think that this is a really interesting landscape and wish there were more conversation between these two fields.
Thank you so much for that talk, Eric. Super provocative and interesting. Have a lot to talk about. And now we get to hear from Jen.
Let's see. Advanced sharing options. Just want to share my screen. There we go. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I have really enjoyed this conference. I've enjoyed the way it's set up. I've enjoyed the talks. I've learned so much. So it's just a real pleasure to be a part of this. I am going to not talk so much about working with stakeholders directly as I am going to talk about working with those who want to work with stakeholders. So a little bit of a pivot on the topic. And also, I found it really hard to think about what success might look like beyond sort of like process elements. So I'm going to talk about instead some of the barriers that might lead one to feel like you had a successful event or partnership. So I've had a number of experiences with public engagement or with stakeholder engagement. I won't go through each of these, but I've been part of sort of large public engagement with science and technology events like Worldwide Views. I've often been the lone social scientist or humanities person on sort of team science projects that have a stakeholder engagement piece to them. And then increasingly, I have worked as a consultant with city and county governments on stakeholder engagement or public engagement exercises. And then I do want to mention this last one. In the last few years, I've worked as a co-PI on an NSF project studying ECAST and some of their participatory technology assessment projects that they run with the federal government. So increasing relationships with how we do stakeholder engagement with government entities. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on today. And I'm calling them clients, partly because I've stepped into this consultant role, but also because I think the word client maybe helps us think about power in some new ways, and uneven power dynamics. And also because a lot of these folks, they have mandates to do this work, maybe through law, maybe through funding mechanisms, but they may not have experience doing it, or they have limited experience doing it. They often have limited resources for doing it. They want to build long-term capacity, but aren't sure how. And there's often like a nervous, like engagement curious behavior, right? They're nervous about it, but they want to leave the door open. And then for me, as somebody who studies these events and relationships, this is sort of like an interesting, impure, frustrating space working on building capacity within these organizations and agencies that are severely constrained. So I'm just going to talk through quickly 7 challenges that I encounter and continue to encounter when I do this work sort of across these projects. And some are stakeholder engagement and some maybe are more sort of public engagement. The first challenge is that I often find when I first sit down with an agency or organization that wants to do stakeholder engagement, that they're already in love with a particular method. So frequently it's a survey or a public meeting because they're most familiar with those sorts of modes, or maybe they saw an exciting new method at a conference and they want to try it. But so I often have to spend a lot of time just figuring out, taking a step back and figuring out not what the stakeholder engagement will be, but why the stakeholder engagement will be. And it's remarkable how often clients haven't actually worked through that question. The second challenge that I find is that agencies often want to engage all the stakeholders or the public, capital P public. We've talked a lot about that in this conference so far. But what I think is interesting about this is it's sometimes it's strategic to say that you want to engage all of the public instead of specific stakeholders. And that is because probably with some sort of agency or organization, they have had engagement with the public, and maybe it's been unpleasant or contentious or difficult. And sometimes drawing the circle wider back out to the public is a way of diluting or diffusing those voices. So sometimes it's just not knowing how to identify publics, and other times I think it's a strategy and something that has to be worked through. I went back and forth over whether to include this, but I should say that I live in Boise now in Idaho, where there have been really significant and occasionally violent conflicts over expertise and over scientific expertise, and certainly citizens and their residents and their relationship with government. And so I just want to sort of call out the affective element here when I sit down to work with folks in government agencies, for example, who've had bad and even threatening experiences with the public. It can lead to some reactions or pathologies around doing stakeholder engagement that I just felt like it was important to call that out, and maybe we can talk more about it in Q&A, but I think with sort of the rise of illiberalism and the challenges to expertise that we're seeing, it's something that we have to think about and talk about more. In my experience, having those experiences can lead to sort of like a risk management approach to public engagement, where public engagement events have to be tightly constrained, and the types of feedback, interaction, relationships are often controlled. So I've been in planning meetings with clients before where they've talked about, am I able to turn the microphone off if I hear something I don't like? for example. So like a real desire to control and silence participants. And I think it sometimes comes from a legitimate place of anxiety and fear. We already heard about this, but sort of a fourth challenge I find is still that social license to operate model really in here is with a lot of clients, that instrumental approach that Eric talked about. And it's a really tricky one to work with. So if I'm working as a consultant and say City Hall has hired me to do something, there's an implicit assumption that I'm helping them to get where they want to go. And I think that's a tension that those of us who work with clients have to think about and work through. And if I sense that there's not like some flexibility around that, I probably will not take that contract. I think that I just want to say that I think there's broad agreement that stakeholder engagement and even public engagement writ large are good things among the people I work with. But it is really, really hard to get people to show up unless they're already angry. So whether it's organizing something like Worldwide Views or organizing, a charrette around urban planning, it's a tough thing. And especially when we talk about engaging diverse publics, which I think, excuse me, is especially hard for government agencies who struggle to invest in and sustain long-term partnerships with diverse publics. And that is really even when they do things like offer incentives for participating, offer childcare, offer translation services, differ their locations, differ times. The investment in the partnerships it takes to really engage diverse publics, especially in a place like Idaho, is not a small challenge. It's a big challenge. It's a tough lift. And then just to go back, maybe echo some of the organizational comments that Eric made about sort of how government entities are put together and function. I spend way more time than I ever anticipated working with sort of community engagement specialists in agencies and helping them talk to other elements or parts of their agencies, and especially talking to the people who they work for and strategizing how to get buy-in from the other parts of the agency. You would be so surprised how little agreement often there is on difficult topics between the parts of agencies. And it's not something I see written about in the literature very much, but in practice is something that's extremely salient. And then finally, I never anticipated this either, but a real barrier to developing those long-term relationships with stakeholders, engaging diverse publics, is the fact that a lot of these agencies are subject to political changes. So you might have a federal agency that's interested in building capacity around stakeholder engagement, and then there's an election, and all of a sudden it's not okay to do public engagement anymore. And that can happen at the city level and at the federal level. And it is significant, and it's something that makes, I think, institutionalizing partnerships really tough. I don't think I have time to talk extensively about strategies, but maybe we can in the Q&A. I would love to continue the conversation then.
Wow, so much to think about. Thank you so much. And then finally, we'll turn to Laura.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Everyone sees it okay? Okay, good. So like Heather said, I work as a conflict resolution and collaboration specialist for the Bureau of Land Management. And in that role for the past 20 years, I've been organizing and facilitating diverse stakeholder groups across the Western United States as they work to address complex and often contentious natural resource issues. When I work with groups, I draw heavily on the principles and practices of collaborative adaptive management. And so that's how I've focused my talk. If I can figure out how to change the slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about collaborative adaptive management as an approach for enabling stakeholder engagement with science, and then I'll discuss some of the principles and practices that make these efforts work. And then I'll briefly review one of the frameworks for defining and measuring success that resonates with me and I think holds some promise, and we can hopefully have some more discussions about that after. So as you've heard from the other panelists, some of the most controversial and politicized debates concern the appropriate management of natural resources. And they're often labeled wicked problems because they're characterized by scientific and technical, as well as regulatory and legal complexity and uncertainty, groups with unequal political power, resources and access to information, diverse and often competing values and goals, and the need for stakeholder and expert engagement, deliberation and negotiation. And last, there are interdependent problems that can't be solved in relative isolation from one another, and they have a range of solutions, each with different implications for people and resources. In 1999, the Committee of Scientists developed a typology for understanding and navigating natural resource issues based on the state of knowledge and agreement on values. Wicked problems is in that lower right-hand corner, and they're a combination of both information and value-based conflicts, meaning that both the state of knowledge and the agreement of values is low. Successful negotiation and resolution of these issues requires ongoing dialogue and deliberation between experts and stakeholders who, in addition to using technically correct information, engage in processes that address the human and social dimensions of resource issues. When this type of interaction is not just an event, but rather a continuous activity, it can build trust and legitimacy for actions and decisions by building familiarity with the issues, the diversity of viewpoints, and the complexity of social and ecological systems involved. This is just another graphic, displaying this concept that natural resource management approaches fall on a continuum defined by the level of collaboration and stakeholder engagement required to effectively address the complexity and uncertainty of a particular situation. So I often use the words expert and stakeholder kind of just as a shorthand, but I want to caveat that with this quote as a reminder that, when it comes to understanding the behavior of complex social ecological systems, no one and yet everyone is an expert. All participants bring useful knowledge and experience to the table, whether it's scientific, technical, traditional, cultural, local, or remembered. And a well-designed, implemented, collaborative adaptive management process will improve the capacity of all participants to learn from different kinds of knowledge. These processes really are grounded in the belief that if you bring the right people together in constructive ways with good information, they will develop reciprocal understanding, shared knowledge, mutual trust and accord, and ultimately produce better outcomes. Many, myself included, argue that creating well-structured, transparent, collaborative processes is as important to effective decision-making as having good scientific information and tools. The key to success is providing opportunities for diverse participants to develop the human capital and the social capital that's needed at various scales to leverage and mobilize resources and to achieve collective action and get stuff done on the ground. When it comes to designing successful collaborative adaptive, that's a tongue twister, management processes, there's really not a recipe or cookie cutter or one size fits all approach because really no two efforts are ever the same. However, there are some foundational principles and practices that apply to all. The first thing that I pretty much always do when I'm asked to facilitate an effort is conduct a situation assessment where I talk individually with a diverse cross-section of key folks to get a better understanding of the local situation and the various issues at play. This provides an opportunity for me to meet and begin to build relationships with some of the critical players, as well as to learn more about their perspectives and hear about their concerns, their thoughts on whether there are opportunities for collaboration and the likelihood of success, their willingness to quote unquote come to the table and under what conditions, and their advice on who else needs to be involved and how best to proceed. This provides important information for conveners and facilitators in terms of deciding whether to move forward with a collaborative effort, and if so, how best to design a successful process. And it also provides participants with an opportunity to share, reflect on, and clarify their own interests and positions with regard to a situation, as well as revealing those of other stakeholders. And it helps build an early body of shared information and helps participants see areas of overlap and agreement, as well as disagreement and misunderstanding, because we typically distribute kind of a high-level report to everyone involved and anyone else who's interested. Assuming the decision is made forward to move forward with the collaborative process, it's important to design a process that matches the scope or the scale and nature of the challenge. When it comes to successful collaborative efforts, you need the right people in the room, both decision makers and doers, and particularly champions. But what that actually looks like will differ depending on any particular situation. A collaborative effort that's focused on the management of one public lands grazing allotment will look very different than one that's focused on a watershed, or one that's focused on exploring ways to address management challenges in the Great Basin sagebrush ecosystem. Similarly, an effort that's focused on endangered salmon will require a different suite of players than one that's focused on the designation of a new national monument. When you're setting up collaborative efforts, the critical challenge is to design and implement arrangements where proper relationships between vertical and horizontal networks can enhance capacity for collective action. One of the frequently noted reasons why collaborative efforts fail is due to a lack of focus on process or process management. Thus, most collaborative efforts benefit from reliance on a trusted person who helps manage these types of multi-party processes and creates safe space for communication, trust and relationship building, shared learning, joint fact-finding, and creative problem solving to occur. I'm going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. When it comes to achieving those process outcomes I just mentioned, I see it as a series of evolving and often iterative phases that kind of build on or reinforce one another. In every description or evaluation of collaborative efforts that I've ever heard or read about, the importance of trust and relationship building as a foundation for success is always noted. My personal experience has been that relationships typically precede substance, and it goes back to that kind of old adage around people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Trust and relationships are born from open, honest, transparent, respectful communication and reinforced by things like understanding, benevolence, reliability, credibility, and competence. One of the important components of collaborative efforts is providing opportunities for mutual learning that engages people to understand different perspectives and approaches, regardless of whether they agree. When it comes to natural resource management, different individuals often have markedly different and strongly held beliefs, opinions, and emotions. They're shaped by people's individual perceptions, education, and personal experience, and they often take the form of positions. So people come to the table typically knowing what they want. But successful collaboration requires moving people from these firmly held positions to better understanding their and each other's interests, why they want what they want, what really matters to them, what their underlying concerns, needs, values, or motivations are. This is critical when it comes to trying to create common ground or shared understanding and develop mutually beneficial and implementable solutions. If you dig deep enough to find out the why, you'll often find that there are different ways for people to get what they want while also giving other people what they want. And it's this type of interest-based negotiation that's the basis for most collaborative and consensus-based processes, because it provides more room to find like win-win versus win-lose outcomes. Joint fact-finding, which refers to efforts designed to get all players together, preferably on the ground as appropriate, to discuss conditions and collect information, is a good way to foster mutual learning and shared understanding through the co-production of knowledge. Joint fact-finding helps level the playing field and create shared knowledge base. It not only helps resolve key areas of uncertainty, but also strengthens personal relationships and builds trust among participants. In other words, it helps connect people to a particular place as well as each other. Furthermore, by involving stakeholders in the joint fact-finding process, the research is enriched and studies become more relevant, and the information is more likely to be used to inform actions because it's understandable to individuals with a range of backgrounds and perspectives and it's seen as legitimate, valid, believable, and trusted. Another important component of collaboration is creating shared visions and creative or synergistic solutions. When people listen to and learn from one another, they gain a richer and new perspective or understanding of the situation. Basically, they start to see things in a different or more complete way. They individually and collectively articulate their values, priorities, interests, and positions. They see how different decisions and options affect others. They identify challenge to fulfilling their own priorities, and they begin to see possibilities and solutions to address challenges that were hidden before. I've heard people equate collaboration with compromise, but I don't believe that that's what happens. Rather, what occurs is synergy. The interaction produces a new and combined effect that's greater than the sum of its parts. Once a group has established relationships and trust and understanding and knowledge and creative solutions, then they need to implement. And one of the great things about collaborative networks is that they add capacity. In other words, they increase the ability to produce, experience, or understand something beyond what would have been possible in the absence of partners. In order to effectively mobilize this added capacity, though, collaborative efforts need to put processes and structures in place that enable them to efficiently and effectively make use of the resources, tools, skills that are provided by the various partners in their collaborative network. The last thing is that collaboration is hard work, and it's important to remember to have fun and celebrate your successes, which we do frequently. So moving on to the topic of defining and measuring success, like I said earlier, there's no one recipe for collaborative adaptive management processes or outcomes, and so that poses a challenge for evaluation. In response to this, scholars have experimented with evaluation frameworks that identify a mix of process characteristics and first and second and third order outcomes. Process characteristics are focused on things like pluralism and linkages, communication and negotiation, transaction and decision-making, social learning. First order outcomes, typically occur immediately after an intervention and commonly include increased knowledge and abilities or human capital, improvements in trust and relationship and communication or social capital, and development of shared understanding and agreement towards a resolution. And second order outcomes such as behavioral changes or changes in practice are closely connected with the specific assistance, while third order outcomes are longer term effects that extend beyond the problem domain being addressed, but can still be attributed in part to the process in question. These outcomes include things like the creation of cross-tail linkages or development or modified or new governance arrangements. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm sorry that I went a little over and we can talk more. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much for your insights. Those were great talks, and I want to see if you have any questions for each other at this point in time about your various experiences and processes. Or I will ask you all a question.
If I can add in one quick reaction. Number one, I think you might have done a really nice job with the ordering here to end on the pragmatic note. And what I liked about that last talk is it reminded me of an element I didn't mention, but the temporal dimensions here are really critical to stakeholder engagement, right? In the context of fire, you lose all traction on working meaningfully with stakeholders once there's fire on the landscape. And so as an emergency manager, part of your job is to stretch time and play with time. And the more, the jurisdictions where I've seen this done well are the ones who foster exactly the kinds of processes you've just described a couple of years or a decade in advance of the fire happening, so that those fire management plans are there in place when it does. And so I really like the pragmatism of the last talk, and it was a good reminder about that temporal aspect.
Can I chime in on that? I completely agree, but I forget which one of you noted that it's really difficult in the absence of a crisis to get stakeholders to engage or people come to the table. So there's always this tension going on there that ideally you want everybody together talking about these things, having these tough discussions, building relationships when we're not in a crisis, chaos, high emotion situation. But when we try to stand those up, nobody comes. And so in my work, I come in a lot of times when we are in that conflict crisis situation, kind of deal with that first, and then hope to, create a stable enough group that will transcend that one particular crisis situation and last long enough over time so that we're getting ahead of the next one, right? Because we're never going to there's always going to be something.
Can I ask Laura a question, Heather?
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, that was such a good talk, Laura. We're all very excited about it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the idea of the facilitator. I'm often a facilitator. I think you are too. But then also, it sounds like you recruit facilitators to work on particular projects. And it looked like you had a lot of images, maybe of like ranchers or something like that in your slides. It can be hard sometimes for some projects to find somebody who both might be trusted by that community and who has like the suite of facilitation skills that you need. And I don't mean to disparage either side, but I wonder how you think about that problem and how you approach that problem in terms of sort of trust building and creating a sense of legitimacy.
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. One, I feel like every process that I get engaged in or know about, they're always strapped to find facilitators or capacity in that area. It's just really difficult. That said, not every facilitator is trusted either. So there is that tension, right? And I think part of it depends on the situation. Sometimes what brings people together and keeps them together is this notion of having a trusted convener, local person, local champion, that it doesn't, and especially if it's not serious crisis conflict, you don't need a super skilled facilitator. In other instances, if there's just lots of bad relationships and bad past history, and you kind of have to have someone that has some of those facilitation conflict resolution skills in the mix. When that happens, so I partner a lot with I find those local community members and champions and partner with them. So they'll either co-facilitate with me, or there may be I hate to say the word steering committee, but some kind of a group on the side that works with me. And so this notion of convener and facilitator, we may have a local rancher or a local conservation district or somebody convene the meetings because they are a trusted broker within that community, and then I come in and facilitate. So two different roles. I've also spent a lot of time trying to teach a lot of local community members how to be better facilitators, which has been mixed success-wise, to be honest with you.
That's not surprising. Of course,
most people are scared to death to do it. That's the number one problem. They could do it, but they're afraid to.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's hard, right? Because you have to kind of put your own emotional commitments to the side to let other people.
Well, and it's important that you say that, because I always feel like we always talk about neutral facilitators, and over the past 20 years, I've come to realize there are no neutral facilitators, right? Everybody's a person. You all have your own stuff. The best you can do is facilitate a neutral process that everyone agrees is a neutral process. And that's what's important.
Okay. So I was wondering, listening to all your talks about the sort of issues of command and control and high level power and authority, or the way in which Shannon was talking about devices and data that could travel across government contexts, given the structures of authority, versus the sort of ground up local engagement, local trust building that Laura emphasized and Jen was talking about and Eric was talking about as part of the thing, and the thing that Shannon wanted to see sort of happen with these things. And I was wondering whether or not there is an irreducible tension between the kind of stuff that travels, the kind of authorities that bridge contexts, and the sort of local stuff, or whether we should always be trying to do something that's bottom up, and the trust and building relationships always begins there. And without that, it just doesn't work. I'm making your life complicated is what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I may fumble this answer, but I'll take a shot. I think that there has to be both. Like we have to always try to be building both is sort of where I've come down on this, because I've come from sort of like a maybe high church STS projects, like Worldwide Views, that are sort of like trying to build democratic engagement with science and technology, and then these maybe more impure but very practical, very connected to policy projects that are embedded in agencies. And I very much want to work with those agencies to build capacity and to build relationships. So this is exactly what I was thinking about when you asked about success, Heather, is I worked with our local government for 4 or 5 years, building capacity, building relationships. And then we had an election, and within a year, every single contact I had in that organization was gone. And so now what? Now where are those relationships? Now where is what kinds of things do we build now? And I sort of think that's a feature of doing this kind of work. And it's very different than a lot of the other presentations I think we've heard at the conference, which are about sort of working with grassroots organizations over time and commitments to problems and things like that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what it made me think.
I would say, I mean, I spend a lot of time, I almost considered, you know, back in the day where I might have been more of a community organizer, more of an organizer working in institutions and, you know, within science as an institution. And I just find that if we're not engaging from both directions, the behavioral shifts and changes that need to happen for people to be able to even have these conversations they just are not present. And so, you know, I'm a huge proponent of from the ground up grassroots, but there has to be that mid zone where, you know, like Laura's talking about facilitation a lot, like where these conversations can happen in conjunction with one another, and those kind of barriers and blockades are able to be dropped.
And do you also need to create explicit linkages with the power structures that exist?
I'd say yeah. Oh, sorry, Shannon.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'd say, yeah, that goes back to that side I was saying where you have to have that appropriate network that's both vertically and horizontally connected.
And
So,
I guess I would just push us a bit, and I would say, like, yes, we have to work in the systems that exist, but we live in an incredibly complex, law-dense, difficult to navigate landscape that requires, you know, vast amounts of technical, scientific, et cetera, legal expertise to be able to wade into. And so can we imagine a different future where things are not that complex? And that's really what I'm feeling very passionate about, is like, how do we make these things easier for people on all sides to kind of wade into and engage?
I was wondering with some of the equipment stuff that you're working on, whether you're running into this very explicit tension between trying to make something that is flexible and tweakable and interoperable in various contexts, but is also trusted by the upper authorities.
Right, and I mean that's a very critical point. Like air monitoring, for instance, you know, low-cost air monitors read at known different points. Some of the projects do. And so instead of being able to, you know, solve for that, the standard is that, well, until it's good enough to, you know, meet the administrative standards that are in place, we can't use the data. And that's, I mean, to me, that's almost like a social behavioral thing, rather than, it's a technical challenge that can be overcome, but like that's a human thing. That's about relationships, and that's about kind of the tension, you know, that exists in this innovation landscape. And that is very solvable.
Okay, so at this point in time, if you don't have more questions for each other or comments on this fascinating theme, I want to turn things over to Megan, who will begin asking questions from our audience. So if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A.
Yes, we have one question already. Mahmoud Farouk says, great talks. Question for Jen. How do you handle a situation when the client is trying to draw a broader stakeholder circle to dilute the influence or work around a difficult stakeholder? Can you ensure legitimacy of such engagement processes when you're excluding some voices by design?
Yeah, that's hard to answer in the abstract, Mahmoud, as I think you probably well know. I think it's just that's one of those many points of discussion that I have with the client and really try to assess out. So that rarely comes through in the first conversation with the client, that they're trying to, bracket a difficult stakeholder. And once I sort of understand that that's what's happening, I really work with them around the advantages and disadvantages of exclusion. And I suppose one strategy that I often use is to build in layers of engagement in whatever the project is. So maybe we do start with a very small group of stakeholders that the client feels they can collaborate with. And we work to sort of develop a process, which then is pitched maybe to a larger circle of stakeholders. Does this feel legitimate? Is this something that you could work with? Would you want to be engaged? And so on, so that it could be that you build a process that allows you to engage with those more vocal stakeholders in a more productive way than existed before. But I have to say, just in response to the last comments, there's like a real socialist hippie in me that is also like, maybe there needs to be these contrarian groups who are like, screw the man, we're not going to participate in your project, we're just going to protest against you. And I don't know, I think there has to be space for that in a democracy as well.
Great. Okay, so Sophia Gutierrez, I hope I pronounced that correctly, says, I realize that most of you practice this kind of outreach in other areas, and as Eric said, you do a lot of public engagement without calling it that. My question is if you've ever reached out or worked with or found relevant knowledge for your practice in the public engagement with science field, either by collaboration with SciCommers or by literature or any other means.
I mean, I can just, Sophia, if you're looking for resources, I'm not quite sure. I think the citizen science community definitely has that kind of interaction zone, but I would also very specifically point to an initiative that's called the Civic Science Lab, I think, and I can hopefully get you a link somehow for that. But there's a lot of conversation that's happening between science communication, engagement fields, and people like myself, practitioners. So it's a very kind of like multi-diverse conversation that is potentially very interesting for what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think like most of the panelists here, we're here in a sense because we find ourselves torn between both sides and plugged in a bit to both sides. And so part of my selfish desires out of this meeting is to be able to poke and prod into the EM community a bit more to think about how this literature applies and how we can engage, because there are some places where I think there's a lot of overlap. So fire management becomes very close, forest management becomes very close to a lot of existing public engagement work, though that's not necessarily true of people working on other hazards. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for this kind of crossover. Though this kind of disconnection can exist sometimes within the public engagement world too, right? So I'll go regularly to science communication conferences that are a very distinct circle from public engagement conferences, which are a very distinct circle from some of the SIT-Sci conferences. And so siloing is certainly a global problem too.
Okay, I have another one for you, Eric. So Ty Branch says, for Eric Kennedy, can you expand on the notion of policing and militarization in emergency management? Though we may be familiar with it as a response, does it have a role in mitigation, and is it unique to a North American context?
Great question, love it. I mean, we can talk more about this in the spatial chat too, but there are lots of questions I think to be asked about what is public engagement? For instance, does being a member of a sheriff's posse count as public engagement? So across the US, you'll see jurisdictions where members of the public are enlisted into paralegal or para-law enforcement duties. And that is an intriguing way to engage the public in different kinds of exercises. I mean, it's certainly, as someone who's done comparative work across jurisdictions, you see it more present in the US because of some of the history of the Civil War, or sorry, not Civil War, the civil defense through the Great Wars and then Cold War. But it's a feature that shows up regularly. And it's one that ought to raise lots of questions about what the right kind of engagement with the public is too. I mean, look at some of the predictive policing work and CompStat, for instance, that raises all sorts of questions that really have been exempt from and flown below the radar of public deliberation because they're pushed forward under this notion that public safety is a broadly agreed upon good, and therefore don't get as much scrutiny as some other efforts might. So I think there's a ton to talk about there, and let's chat more in the spatial chat about it.
Okay. And we have another one from Bruce Lewenstein, who says, another great panel. I was intrigued by Jen Schneider's challenge that we who want to engage be clear, or at least more self-conscious about who we are. Could you elaborate on more on multiple we's, some of the issues to think about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in that presentation, I was specifically referring to working with or for large agencies or complex organizations where the public engagement effort or the stakeholder engagement effort maybe is invisible to the rest of the agency, isn't valued by the rest of the agency, or even other parts of the agency are working at cross purposes to the public engagement effort. So we might look at trying to do a public engagement effort with the Department of Energy, for example, and maybe there is one program or one directorate that's trying to do that. But if there are other efforts in the agency that undermine that, all of a sudden your job as a facilitator and organizer becomes much more difficult. But I think too, just to echo Laura's point, that who the we is, that you as a facilitator, you as an engagement person also bring a number of selves with you into projects and a number of commitments into projects. And it's good to be reflexive about that too.
If there's a second here while other people are putting in questions, I'm curious to hear from other panelists about where the line between public ends and stakeholder begins, where the line between stakeholder ends and we begins, and how you deal with people who have multiple identities and locations within or across those categories.
I'm going to throw this out there, but I've kind of always just stayed in the mindset of stakeholders self-select. Like we know who some of them are just by default of the issue or the situation or the location or whatever, but you know, they're interested in affected parties. But if somebody from the public, you know, who decides they're a stakeholder and is interested enough to be considered a stakeholder, then I don't think we have the right to deny them that label necessarily. Now, that doesn't mean everyone has the same level of, you know, power or impact or, you know, but still, that's just kind of how I have always been. It's like if people who are impacted by or interested in or affected by the decision or can sabotage the outcome, those are kind of where I look to start. And then anybody else who says they're a stakeholder, who am I to say they're not?
Can I also say, in practice, when I work with various agencies and organizations, they use stakeholder engagement and public engagement interchangeably. They don't see a difference. So there may be like legal mandates that point to a difference, but Heather, I was actually interested in your definition that you gave at the beginning, because I think in practice things are like a lot mushier than that.
Yeah, so I gave that definition because I was trying to differentiate, for the purposes of this conference, the different senses of public. There are all these different conceptions of the public. And what I wanted to differentiate, first of all, was, you know, open calls where you have whoever comes, and it's you just like throw open the doors. You don't try to cultivate pre-relationships. You just say, come to our thing. And that's what I called the volunteer engagement. When you go work with a particular community, very often it's not a stakeholder engagement because, like, say it's a fence line community, you don't actually go and necessarily bring the industries that are affecting that community in to the same meeting. Working with the community becomes working with the community, and it's not about all the stakeholders involved. And then, you know, when I talk to my colleagues who work with Indigenous populations, they're like, do not call us stakeholders, because it's really offensive. We don't hold stakes, we hold rights, we hold sovereignty, we hold, you know, this much stronger thing. And it's not about interest, it's something much stronger. And I was like, whoa, okay, well, and then there's the demographically representative sample stuff that World Wide Views does, where you like recruit a particular sample of the public to represent. And I thought, like, this is really different. These are really different. We should talk about what looks like success in these different spaces. And there's clearly overlap. I mean, Jen, you've done a couple different kinds. Shannon, you've done a couple different kinds. Everyone's work sort of blurs the boundaries, but there's also something normatively interesting about the different conceptions of the public that are involved and how that structures the process that then proceeds. So, you know, when you have stakeholder engagement, you don't just do an open call and call it good, right? That would just be a huge mistake, right? And you worry a lot about facilitation. Because
yes, to that end, Heather, like when you described it, you put, you know, like a commitment tied to the word, right? Public engagement is more like, we're just gonna throw it out there, share information, get some feedback. Often it's maybe a one-time, or there's a different level of expected commitment over the long term, I think, in the kind of stakeholder process versus the public engagement process. Although Jen is completely correct that everybody, including myself, uses those words interchangeably all the time.
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher, so of course I'm like, no, let's see if we can clean up the language, because that always helps. Not necessarily, but sometimes it does. So yeah, but we do have one more question.
Yes, we do. Sophia responds again, actually coming back to Jen's presentation, I'd like to see more of the last slide that we only had a glimpse of, and seemed like it talked about strategies to deal with the challenges we mentioned. Could she elaborate on that part of her talk?
Strategies for success. Like,
Heather, is it okay if I share that screen for a sec? Okay. Yeah, so I don't have any easy answers, but it's sort of, you know, like when if you're a professor, using the whiteboard sometimes really improves your teaching, even though it's like a super low tech way of doing it. Actually, I use a planning form that Jared Talley and I developed out of some research we did that's super simple, sort of 5 questions that really encourages the client to articulate their objectives and then make sure that our design always connects to our objectives. And that has been just a hugely basic, helpful sort of North Star for projects. So that's one thing. I would just say that I just really learned to develop a lot of sensitivity to political contexts. And again, sometimes that requires really working pretty in depth with a client over time, because they don't always tell you what their real motivations are. And I don't think they're being purposefully misleading, but they may themselves sort of be dealing with multiple contingencies. Identifying policy entrepreneurs within agencies who can really help navigate these sorts of events or relationships or projects has been hugely important. And we found it important in the research project we're doing as well. And then I didn't talk much about this, but I've sort of skirted being a consultant with some energy industries. I've never really committed to that because it's never felt good to me. But just as a facilitator, I've had to be clear about sort of my personal policies, my bright lines around when I will do stakeholder engagement for an organization and when I feel like they maybe are not acting in good faith. So those are, that's just a quick review of where I was going to end.
Does does that sort of speak to the rest of your experience with these kinds of things? There are times when you're asked to step into a space and you're like, no, I don't really want to facilitate that, or I don't really feel the agency buy-in and the hierarchy of power that I know exists, so this feels sort of pointless. Or there's a lot of ways, I think, as Ben Pauli, there's a lot of ways we can fail, and paying attention to failing better is crucial. Does anyone have any final thoughts?
I guess the one thing I would add is I think that's where that notion of doing a situation assessment helps too, because there's been plenty of times where, you know, you get a request from one person, so all you're hearing is their view of the situation, what they think is possible, right? And so, but then you start to talk to everybody else and you really understand what's going on. And we've come back and said, this is not set up for collaboration to be successful because of buy-in or agency support or transparency or willingness to what we're going to talk about and how we're going to handle, you know, and then to have that all out there and that everybody sees. So it's not like I'm just, you know, it's like everybody gets that there's a context within which this has to occur in order to be successful. And that context isn't there. All the decision makers aren't on board, whatever it is.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for all these insights.